Massive news for the Emperor's own Golden Guardians of Terror today. We've got Toughness 7 Terminators, a stratagem to resurrect Custodians from the dead, and some very scary rules for Trajann Valoris, including getting a 2+ invul save for a fight. Let's see what the Adeptus Custodes can do in 10th edition 40k. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking Adeptus Custodes and having a look through the 40k faction preview for 10th edition for the Golden Guardians of the Emperor. Throughout night, I think they've had a fairly decent time of it, usually having the raw elite muscle to clear the enemy from the midfield and being very hard to take down with their big saves and toughness characteristics, and that doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. Here's a quick list for some of the main reveals from Warhammer community today. There's a few interesting trends for the army, including their leadership and boosted toughness. We've got both their faction rule and their detachment special rule. Martial Qatar is the normal rule for the army, a purely melee buff now. The launch detachment is going to be called the Shield Host, and that one gives you some defense against mortal wounds, maybe a slightly oddly specific faction rule if that is indeed all that they get for it. There's a couple of other small rules, including a Sisters of Silence Great Blade and one stratagem for the army that allows you to resurrect slain Custodes, and then 3 interesting datasheets, one for Trajann Valoris, one for the Allarus Custodians, and one for the bolter-armed Prosecutor squad of the Sisters of Silence. Jumping straight on into it, and we do get a few hints with these reveals of some army trends for the Custodes going forward. First up, it seems that they've got a boost to their toughness stat. The standard Custodes will be toughness 6, judging by Trajann Valoris, and the Terminators toughness 7. I'm perhaps not too surprised to see an increase to these, given that we've seen a toughness boost for Terminators. Seems like this is part of Games Workshop trying to utilise their entire toughness chart. Now it has been stretched out really quite a lot further, all the way up to toughness 14. Probably won't make the biggest difference in the world against anti-tank weapons, which have generally increased in strength as well, but should mean that Custodes are significantly harder to kill with medium strength weaponry. Things like heavy bolters are going to have a far harder time into them if they're wounding on a 5+. It does seem that they're still retaining their excellent saves. The units that we've seen so far have a 2+ save and a 4+ invul. I guess it would be handy to see standard Custodians with Guardian Spears though, just to check that they're not on a 5+. Otherwise, it seems that Adeptus Custodes are still going to be Leadership 6+ as standard. I wouldn't have been too surprised if they'd been a 5+, but it really seems that Games Workshop are being pretty stingy with Battle Shock immunity. A 6+ leadership places them no better than Space Marines now. It really does seem commitment to the theme that no army is going to be immune to Battle Shock, and only big scary faction commanders and special characters seem to get Leadership 5. The new version of auric weapons, the Guardian Spears and the Castellan Axes and things, they appear to have gained assault and shooting out to 24 inches. Previously they were rapid fire with their guns, and this means that you can actually advance them a fair bit faster towards the enemy. You could have standard Custodians with Guardian Spears closing down the foe a lot quicker. The assault keyword isn't particularly common in 10th edition. I was kind of interested to see the new rules for the Sisters of Silence. It appears that they have strong defense against psychic direct damage, but don't actually interfere with psychic abilities, at least on their normal squads. Games Workshop had dropped a few hints about some things turning off psychic abilities. I'd guess that the Collector's Assassin might well do that. Seems like it might just tone down their psychic defense a little bit. They won't interfere with things like, say, Space Marine Librarians, unless they're actually dealing psychic damage to the Sisters themselves, or the Sisters are going on the attack and trying to damage them. In the free text, Games Workshop confirmed one thing about Adeptus Custodes unit abilities. Most datasheets in 10th edition tend to just have the one special rule, something that makes them stand out and act a bit more unique as a unit, where it seems that the Custodes with their status as heroes are going to be getting 2. One of them's going to be a more normal baked into their datasheet type ability, the other one's going to be a once per game type effect, potentially a big boost when they need it most, and we have seen a teleport style one for the Allarus Terminators that we'll get onto later. Finally, just throughout trends within 10th edition, I feel like Custodes are really going to like the fact that there's a lot less units with -1 damage. They'd usually be particularly unhelpful to match up against, given that their Guardian Spears are often damaged too. I feel like that's going to make the Custodes 2 damage battle line just really quite effective against the field a bit more, particularly as it seems like they've got some solid rules for punching up against tough stuff. Overall, a few big changes for the faction there. Seems like they're going to be feeling tougher than ever, though I am kind of surprised how dedicated Games Workshop is to keeping Battle Shock relevant. I feel like if anyone was going to be near immune to leadership, the Custodes would be, every single one of them basically being a mini hero. Getting into the rules previews proper though, next up we have the Martial Qatar. This one was introduced in 9th edition, and it's one of Games Workshop's very slightly nightmarish turn-by-turn upgrades. The old system being just a little bit obtuse to the first time that you read it through. Basically, you have 6 different Katars, take 3 of them and put them in an order, and then each turn you can either use one of the abilities, move on to the second one of that, or just jump forward to the next one. Maybe not too hard when you wrapped your head around it, but I feel like it felt a bit needlessly complicated to many. Now, as with really quite a lot in 10th edition, it really is super simple, and unlike the old one which had a bit of focus on both range and melee, this is now a pure melee buff, pretty much cementing Custodes as a focus on close combat. It's going to be more about the Guardian Spears in combat than it is about shooting them. The way it works is that you get access to 3 different stances that you can trigger at the start of the fight phase. You have to pick one to use for your entire army, and you can choose between one defensive buff or 2 different damage buffs. Basically look down at all the combats that you're just about to fight and choose which one is going to be the single most useful. For the choice of stances, you have the option of Captaris, Decatarai or Rendax. Captaris in this new version is the defensive one. This one gives you a -1 to hit in melee, so a nice solid boosted defense there if you think you're going to be taking a bunch of hits and you have the risk of losing miniatures. It seems that you get to choose your Martial Catar stance both during your opponent's turn and during your turn, so this one seems like it could be a useful one to choose during the enemy turn, perhaps when your units are going to get charged by a bunch of enemy ones, and they'll usually be fighting first and potentially killing Custodes before you get to fight back. In that case, the -1 to hit to hopefully have a few more of them survive, that might be the most valuable thing. Otherwise, Decatarai is basically a flat damage increase. You get sustained hits 1 on all of your attacks, sustained hits being the one where you get a 6 to hit generates an additional hit. Typically in combat, if you're hitting on a 2+, that would be a plus 20% to your damage output. A couple of the Custodes do seem to hit a little bit worse than this now, like those Castellan axes. But either way, in general, I'd consider this the one to go for if you're generally wounding your targets on a 3+ in melee. Otherwise, you might just be better off with Rendax. Rendax, on the other hand, keeps its flavour as hunting down big enemy monsters and big tanks. This one's probably the one that you want to use against armies like Imperial Knights, and it basically gives you a 10th edition favourite of lethal hits on all of your units in combat. 6s to hit auto wound the enemy, so it will be really quite a nice one if you're going to be wounding a whole ton of vehicles on a 5+. Knights or big vehicle armies won't really thank you for that. If you were hitting on a 2+ and you were wounding the enemy on a 5+, it amounts to around about a 40% melee damage boost, which is really quite significant. It certainly does beat out Decatarai against things that you wound on a 5. Overall, seems like a fairly solid set of options. I guess if you're in your turn, you probably want to go with one of the 2 damaged ones, hopefully lay the enemy low before they even get to strike, and that way you destroy more enemy models and also lose fewer of yours. Captaris does seem decent in the enemy fight phase though, particularly if they're not hitting on a particularly great number to start with, perhaps hitting on a 4 but with decent damage. Overall though, seems like a very solid faction rule. I feel like it is going to make Custodes melee a bit more relevant than range for the most part. Otherwise though, we've also got rules for the Adeptus Custodes main detachment. This one's going to be called the Shield Host, and this one kind of feels similar to the Emperor's Chosen one, as it basically gives you a 4+ feel no pain type save against mortal wounds only. Previously, the Aegis of the Emperor rule gave you a 4+ invul and a 6+ feel no pain against mortal wounds. It was the Emperor's Chosen Shield Host that gave you the 4+ save against them, so maybe this is going to be the equivalent of that, and then we'd get other detachment rules with the different flavours of Shield Host, ones that are in a bit more flavour with the other shield companies. From the units that we've had previewed so far, it looks like the invul saves are likely just migrated onto the actual datasheets, not really needing a universal special rule for that, so they're not really lost. And I guess admittedly that is a very decent survivability boost. Mortal wounds are usually an excellent way of damaging the Custodes. They do have decent toughness and pretty great saves, so negating all of that is great if you can. In 10th edition 40k though, it does seem that mortal wounds might just be a tiny bit rarer. Previously in 9th edition you could have psychic armies just spamming mass amounts of them as their primary damage, things like Grey Knights and Thousand Sons. It sounds like those kind of armies are going to be a lot more direct damage with their psychic powers rather than just pure mortals. I guess it will still be nice when they crop up though, things like the devastating wounds on things like assault cannons, exploding vehicles, or those universal stratagems like tank shock and grenades. I think it will still be useful. It does maybe kind of imply that the other shield detachments might not get this sort of save against mortal wounds, though I suppose you could have a rule that still gives you a 6+ save against them and some other buff if you wanted an alternative. Either way, it's certainly no bad thing though, will definitely add to the survivability of the faction, just maybe not quite as exciting as some other detachment rules that we've seen. Moving on to other previews, we've got a couple of individual rules, and first up we have the Vigilators Executioner Great Blades from the Sisters of Silence. Two attacks hitting at strength 5 and damage 2, they have lost a pip of AP. For some reason they're listed as ballistic skill here rather than weapon skill, but I guess they are melee weapons, so I suppose they're not throwing them or anything. Lots of power weapons and things do appear to have lost a bit of AP this edition to try and make the armor saves a bit more usable, so I suppose that's not the end of the world there. They have picked up some rather nasty rules to help them kill Psychers. They've both got Anti-Psyker 4+, and Devastating Wounds as well. Devastating Wounds is just pretty nice to have in general. On 6s you'll be ignoring the armor saves anyway as your 2 damage becomes mortals. Of course this is extra nasty on Psychers. You'll also wound them on a 4+, and both of those wounds will be mortal wounds as they count as a critical wound. Putting those two together, and if you did have a squad of 5 Vigilators, get them into an enemy Psyker, and on average they do around about 6 or 7 wounds to just about any Psyker in the game, unless they've got some sort of mortal wound protection. It's not bad, though a unit of 5 of them isn't exactly going to be killing Greater Demons or Abominant Knights or anything, though it could certainly take a big chunk out of them. I do kind of feel that it might be kind of hard to deliver into their optimal target as well. If any big scary Psyker really doesn't want to be in combat with them, it's maybe not the hardest thing in the world, seeing as they'll only be moving a short distance, and they're not exactly the hardest models to kill if they're exposed. Still though, these girls certainly seem to be particularly scary against big Psykers in combat. Perhaps one of the more surprising reveals out of all of this is the new stratagem for the Custodes, this one called Vigil on Ending. Oddly enough, this one is a 1 command point stratagem to target a depleted Adeptus Custodes infantry unit, and he gets to restore 1 destroyed model to the squad. The flavour text of this one basically has the Custodian model rise from the dirt, still capable of doing his duty to the Emperor despite taking grievous wounds. I must admit I wasn't really expecting the Custodes to have a 1 CP resurrection model mechanic though. It does have a couple of restrictions in that you can't target character models, and you can't use it on the same squad more than once per battle, but still despite that it does look like it's got potentially some pretty massive value. As we'll see in a second, you could be resurrecting a Toughness 7 4-wound Terminator for 1 CP there. Even at current cost that would be 60 points restored to the battle. For the returned model, threat and wounds alone, that's really quite high value. On top of that though, you could potentially do some shenanigans with positioning. It looks like this would happen before objective scoring in the command phase, so you might be able to get more objective control points onto an objective, or chain outs to one that you can't quite reach now. If you could ever use this to both restore a model and earn your victory points, then that would be massive. Plus on top of that, you can put the restored guy closer to the enemy if you'd like to, and then later in the turn you might get a shorter charge as a result, so maybe could be a tool for reaching enemy units that are really quite far away if that's necessary. Overall seems like a really powerful stratagem, some positioning shenanigans, plus a very valuable model restored to the board. Seems like a very tempting one to use if you ever get some good targets for it. Finally for the Custodes previews, we've got a trio of datasheets. Starting out, we've got the big man himself, Trajann Valoris, someone who's basically been in auto-include status within the Adeptus Custodes army, at least in competitive lists for a good while now, so much so that didn't really even change when he went up about 40 points midway through 9th. From his stat line, his toughness hasn't changed an enormous amount. He's still got his 2+ save and a 4+ invul, and he retains his 5+ feel no pain, so that hasn't changed there. The altered bits are that his toughness has gone up from toughness 5 to toughness 6, which I think makes it really quite likely that the similar Custodes that also had a toughness of 5 will follow suit as well. But he has lost a wound for his trouble, he's gone down from 8 to 7. Usually he should be fairly well protected though, he does have the leader keyword, so he will be joining a squad. Weapons wise, his Watcher's Axe has got a little bit more dangerous on the shooting side of things. It's strength 5, AP 2 and damage 3 now. Kind of scary that that's a weapon that can pose a pretty credible threat to Terminators even on the move. In melee he's also not too changed really. Once more he's lost a pip of AP there like a bunch of other power weapons, but is still strength 10 and damage 3. I guess the strength 10 is arguably a bit of a nerf, seeing as he won't be wounding all vehicles on a 3+ these days. He'll be wounding on a 5 against quite a lot of things that are bigger than standard battle tanks. Probably the most fun thing about Mr. Valoris though is still that moment shackle. In 9th edition it was choose between 3 very powerful fight phase abilities to get the jump on the opponent in one way or another, and that doesn't really seem to have changed all that much in 10th. It still seems to have had the same sort of feel to it. No matter what situation he finds himself in the fight phase, you are going to get some big value to it if you trigger it before he goes down. First up, and perhaps the most simple option, is to flat out double his attacks for a fight phase. Previously it was fights twice, but he'd actually have to survive to do that, so that could be a little bit questionable sometimes. A big 12 attacks at strength 10 and damage 3 are going to tear a massive chunk out of things, particularly with the martial guitars like sustained or lethal hits. The second option is the chance to activate it for a 2+ invul save for the fight phase. That's near enough going to guarantee that he lives at least for one turn, and if he did get hit by something truly massive and he happened to fail the save, I guess you could always command point reroll it with almost certainty that you pass the second time. Again, really quite a big deal, near guarantees that he survives. Finally, and also very powerfully, is that once per battle he can trigger the fight's first rule, this one being a much bigger deal in 10th edition compared with 9th edition, as it means that if your opponent charges you, if you have this rule, then your unit's going to get to fight first, because you get to select the first unit out of the fight phase. Seeing as he's a leader, he will give that to the rest of his squad as well. That could make his squad basically unchargeable by certain units. I feel like there's not a lot of things in the game that could comfortably take an entire round of Adeptus Custodes combat backed up by Mr. Valoris. Until that's triggered, you might just not be able to charge his unit with a whole bunch of your choices, unless you either have something that's big enough to tank all the damage, or you're happy to throw it away. Overall, it's a really powerful rule no matter which one of those three you wind up taking up. In spite of the massive extra damage or defense, I feel like the fight's first could be the single biggest of the three though. Finally, for his actual leading abilities, it's actually a little bit simpler than I might have guessed. Previously, he had to give your units reroll ones to hit and wound. It looks like that one's gone away, and it does appear as well that he's lost any sort of command point farming thing that was previously on his warlord trait. What he has gained though is an interesting ability to basically protect his squad against enemy modifiers. This one's far bigger and more encompassing than most of those modifier rules have been so far. Not only is it things like hit and wound rolls, but it's also characteristics as well. So things that might impede the squad's movement, like the Tyrannid Barb Gaunts or the Death Guard's -1 toughness from their contagions. It is a bit weird having a command rule that's basically dependent on your opponent trying to target the unit with debuffs. Still though, the reliability that brings and just having your unit function as intended really is quite powerful. It might be a lot more so against some armies that go heavy on them as opposed to others that don't. Overall though, he's still looking rather mighty indeed. A decent leadership ability combined with that mighty moment shackle. It will be interesting to see how he stacks up against other commanders like the shield captains on foot. Moving on, and next up we've got Terminators. The Allarus Custodians have certainly gained a new lease of life in 9th edition by getting OBSEC back. They are really quite commonly run in Custodes lists these days. In 10th edition, perhaps the most obvious change that they've got is a boost to their toughness. They've gone from toughness 5 all the way up to toughness 7. At that value, they're only a little bit behind the Space Marine Rhino at toughness 9 these days. It is going to give them some solid durability against things like heavy bolters or assault cannons and things, now wounding them on 5s. It is quite handy to see a more standard custodian unit, as it means that we get an idea of their auric weapons with things like the Castellan Axe and Guardian Spear, plus a couple of unique things for them like the Ballistus Grenade Launcher. Going down their weapon stats, I'd say the Ballistus Grenade Launchers have seen a bit of a side grade. They get a few more shots with D6 shots now, plus the 10th edition blast keyword is pretty great. But in exchange for that, they have been toned down from strength 5 to strength 4, and the AP's got worse as well, as they're only AP 1 now. Still though, a fairly nice supplement to their shooting, will be nice for clearing hordes. The auric weapons, both the Castellan Axe and the Guardian Spear, at shooting get 2 shots out to 24 inches. They get the assault keyword so you can advance and fire them, and these ones haven't really been changed too much at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 2. In combat, we have seen a few more shifts though. It seems like the Guardian Spear and the Castellan Axe have a bit more to differentiate them. The Spear's gained an extra attack, 5 attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2. The Castellan Axe only has 4 attacks, it only hits on a 3+, not 2, and is strength 9, AP -1, but a big damage 3. Damage 3 Castellan Axes do seem to have been on the wish list for Custodes players for really quite a while. Unfortunately though, with fewer attacks, only hitting on a 3+ and only AP -1, I feel like that's enough to outweigh the jump from damage 2 to damage 3. Overall, I feel like the Guardian Spear is probably going to win out against the majority of targets, even tough ones, seeing as the axe will still be wounding on 5s against a bunch of stuff. Finally, we've got the Misericordias, which now no longer give you extra attacks apparently. They just are another option that you can strike with. 5 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1. I guess against certain targets it might actually be preferable compared with the Castellan Axe. If you've got a Guardian Spear though, it's basically entirely redundant. Finally, on the abilities side of the datasheet, we've got a trio of special rules. Interestingly, it looks like the Vexilla could be a squad upgrade now. You get to add one to the objective control characteristic of models in the unit if you have one, taking them up from 2 to 3. I guess that would help out. They are going to be the sort of unit that's fighting for midfield objectives. Hopefully that isn't the only way to field the Vexilla though. I think it would be a bit sad if you didn't still have the Vexillus Praetor, seeing as the Custodians don't exactly have a huge amount of units to choose from already. Otherwise, it looks like their unique datasheet rule is Slayers of Tyrants, a really quite big reroll wound rolls against characters, monsters, and vehicles. These guys are going to be thoroughly lethal against taking down the toughest stuff in the game. With reroll wound rolls, that's going to allow the Guardian Spears to wound things like Toughness 12 Land Raiders most of the time. It's really quite a nice boost, as they should be able to handle things that are less tough than that pretty easily just with their base profile. On average, with that boost, a unit of 3 Allarus Custodians does around about 9 wounds to something like a Space Marine Rhino. That seems solid enough to me, and it would get slightly better with the Martial Catars as well. Finally, these guys seem to have an example of one of those once per game Custodes abilities that we mentioned. Their From Golden Light rule allows them to teleport once per game, disappearing from the board at the end of the enemy turn, and to come in as reinforcements 9 inches away from the enemy in yours. Seems pretty handy if you didn't want them locked in combat with something that just wasn't really a good idea. They might be able to deep strike down and use some of their shooting or get on an objective or something, and even still threaten a long charge if they wanted to. Overall, obviously we can't really weigh up how strong they'll be without a points cost, but I feel like this datasheet does have a fair amount of interesting stuff on it. Great big tanky Terminators with rerolls in melee against big stuff, plus a fair amount of anti-horde shooting to clear out littler targets. Finally, we've got a few more rules for the other Talon of the Emperor in the Sisters of Silence, and we get to see the new datasheet for their Prosecutor squad, the more troop-style sisters armed with bolters. They don't really have any enormous changes on their stat line, pretty similar to the Sisters of Battle. They do get the Custodes leadership of a 6+, and they do have the battle line keyword, so you can take 6 squads of them if you wanted to. The bolter profile is the standard one that the sisters get. They don't get to fire 2 shots out to 24 inches like the Space Marines do. I feel like the most interesting thing for the Sisters of Silence though is usually going to be their anti-psyker abilities. Looks like for your standard battle line sisters, these girls get a 3+ feel no pain against psychic attacks, and then they've got a rule called Purity of Execution. Each time a model in this unit makes an attack against a psyker target, you get the precision keyword and devastating wounds. Precision would allow them to target enemy characters within the unit if there was one hidden there. And devastating wounds means that wound rolls of a 6 deal a mortal wound instead of their regular damage. Even with that though, if they happen to be within 12 inches of a psyche unit and got their full 10 shots, I still think that will be a little bit underwhelming on the damage side. I guess it could give you a reasonable chance of sniping a minor psychic support character if you got lucky with the 6s. It still doesn't really feel like something to be relied on though. I must admit, I feel like they're going to be a bit less useful for the anti-psyker role these days. Now they don't interfere with any psykers that aren't dealing direct damage, I feel like that is going to be a small nerf to them. Still though, could certainly have a very good role within the Custodians army still. It's nice to have some relatively cheap units to be a little bit more expendable, doing things like holding objectives, grunt work or screening, as opposed to having to dedicate very expensive golden boys to that. Overall, I'd say it's a positive enough preview for the Adeptus Custodes in my opinion. Still look like they're going to be fairly tanky and indomitable, and pretty terrifying in melee as well with those weapon stats plus the martial Catar. For picks of the rules, I feel like Trajann Valoris' Fight First ability is pretty brutal. The reroll wounds that the Allarus get is really quite nice against any hard targets, and I feel like that 1 command points to restore a Custodian to life stratagem is going to get used a fair bit. Let me know your thoughts on the rules though down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I will try and post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.